seated, please.
All right, we are back on. Defendants present, represented by counsel. Got a little bit of movement going on, but I think we're good. I understand the state is ready to proceed with its next witness.
State's ready, Judge.
All right, let's just make sure if we have any additional movement, let's get everybody in if they're supposed to get in. Okay, yeah, let's go ahead. Let's get the panel.
All rise for the jury, please. Please sit.
Welcome back. Hopefully everybody did enjoy their lunch. We are ready to proceed with the evidence in the case. I appreciate everybody's attention. Stay ready to proceed.
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the state calls Agent Jason Seacrist. Agent Jason Seacrist.
Swear to tell the truth, whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
I will.
Good, proceed.
Good afternoon.
Hey, good afternoon.
Go ahead and introduce yourself to the jury. Tell them your name and spell it for the court reporter.
My name is Jason Seacrist, Seacrist.
And how are you employed?
I'm an assistant special agent in charge at the Georgia Bureau of Investigation.
Okay. And what is the Georgia Bureau of Investigations?
The GBI is a state law enforcement agency that's primarily tasked with assisting local law enforcement or other law enforcement agencies in criminal investigations.
Okay. And is the GBI made up of like two different sections, the crime lab and the investigative division?
That's correct. There are actually 4 divisions in the GBI, 2 of which are the investigative division and the division of forensic science.
Okay. So what's the difference between those 2 divisions, just briefly?
The investigative division is tasked with doing exactly what it sounds like, which is conduct the actual criminal investigation. Part of that would be conducting interviews, part of that would be collecting evidence. And once those items are done, then they are turned over, evidence is turned over to the Division of Forensic Science for actual scientific testing.
Okay. And where is the headquarters located?
Atlanta, Georgia.
Okay. Now, other than the headquarters, are there various regions with different offices?
Yes, ma'am. The investigative division is divvied up into 15 regional field offices that each cover, generally speaking, about 10 counties.
Okay. And which region are you assigned to?
I'm assigned to the Region 4 field office in Douglas, Georgia. We cover 11 counties.
Okay. And how long have you been with the GBI?
Approximately 10 years.
Any previous law enforcement experience?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Now, what are your primary duties in your position there with GBI?
Currently, I'm a supervisor out of our office. Our office has 5 field agents, 2 crime scene specialists, an office manager. I am, again, the assistant special agent in charge, and then the special agent in charge is the top supervisor in the office.
Okay. And are you post-certified?
Yes, ma'am, I am.
What does that mean?
So POST stands for the Peace Officer Standards and Training Council. They're the ones that establish the credentials for becoming a police officer in the state of Georgia. Being post-certified means that you have completed the what's known as the Police Academy, and then every year after that, you've also completed additional training to maintain your certification.
Okay. And as a post-certified agent with the GBI, do you have arrest powers under Georgia law?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Now, I want to turn your attention to the investigation into the death of someone by the name of Ahmaud Arbery. Are you familiar with that investigation?
Yes, ma'am.
Did you become involved in that investigation at some point?
Yes, I did.
Okay. How did you become involved?
On the morning of May 6th of 2020, I received a phone call from one of our command staff. She advised that I was being tasked to assist the regional office in Kingsland in the investigation into the death of Ahmaud Arbery.
Okay. Now, were you being assigned the lead role in that investigation?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Do you know who was assigned the lead role in that investigation?
Assistant Special Agent in Charge Richard Dial.
Okay. And you said you became involved on May 6, 2020?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So at the point where you got the call, what did you do?
I packed my bags and I came over to Kingsland.
Okay.
I got the call about 9 o'clock in the morning, and I arrived at the Kingsland office at about 12:30.
Okay. Now, what were your duties as it pertains to the investigation itself?
Primarily was just to assist ASAC Dial in whatever investigative leads were need to be followed. Eventually, it culminated primarily into 2 tracks of the investigation, one being Mr. Roddy Bryan and one being Mr. Larry English. And then, of course, with other miscellaneous, I would say, interviews or lead follow-up as they occurred.
Okay. So when you essentially got to Agent Dial, were you briefed on the investigation thus far?
Yes, ma'am, I was.
Okay. And was that from Agent Dial?
It was from Agent Dial, and as we were beginning to review the investigative work that had already occurred.
Okay. Now, were you given the file of Glenn County Police Department?
Yes, we were.
Okay. Are you familiar with the term neighborhood canvass?
Yes, ma'am.
Can you tell us what that is?
A neighborhood canvass is where you go to an area where a crime has occurred, and you knock on every door that you can find in that area, trying to identify additional witnesses or people who had additional information regarding the incident.
Okay. And to your knowledge, did GBI agents in this case do neighborhood canvasses?
That's correct.
Okay. Are you familiar with a neighborhood by the name of Fancy Bluff?
Yes, ma'am, I am.
Okay. And was that neighborhood a part of the canvassing in this case?
Yes, ma'am, it was.
Okay. Where is Fancy Bluff located in proximity to Satilla Shores?
It is directly across, I think it's Highway 17, probably within a mile or 2 of where the incident occurred.
Okay. Now, did you participate particularly in any of that neighborhood canvass?
Not in the blanket neighborhood canvass, but I participated as it came to specific residences nearby in those areas where it had identified that we needed to do interviews.
Okay. Do you remember when you started doing interviews, like what date?
It was on May 7th.
Okay. Now, do you recall a couple by the name of Diego Perez and Brooke Perez?
Yes, ma'am, I do.
Okay. How do you know them?
They were living in the neighborhood of Satilla Shores. I believe they were a couple residences away from Mr. English's property.
Okay. And did you interview them in this case?
Yes, ma'am, I did.
Do you remember when you interviewed them?
It would have been on May 7th.
Okay. are you familiar with a couple by the name of Danielle Stoddard and her, not Stoddard, but Stoddard, and her husband, James Stoddard?
Yes, I am.
Okay, how are you familiar with them?
Again, there was an interview that was done at their residence.
Okay, when did you do that interview?
I believe it was also May 7th.
Okay, and are you familiar with a person by the name of Matthew Albenze?
Yes, ma'am, I am.
How are you familiar with him?
Mr. Albenze was the one who contacted the non-emergency line on the day of the incident, and he lived on Jones Road, and I believe I interviewed him there or participated in an interview.
Okay, and is that, what neighborhood was that in,
That
located
would be in Satilla Shores.
Okay, and the Stoddards, do you recall where they lived?
It was the Fancy Bluff area.
Okay. Now, you mentioned before that a part of your role in the investigation was the track of William Roddy Bryan.
That's correct.
Okay. At some point, did you interview Mr. Bryan?
Yes, ma'am, I did.
Do you remember how many times you interviewed him?
There were 2 formal interviews, what I would call formal interviews.
Okay, and when was the first one?
The first one was on May 11th
Of what year?
of 2020.
Where was that interview, where did it happen? Where did it occur?
It occurred at the DNR regional office on, I believe it's Conservation Way here in Brunswick.
Okay, it's 196A. So, was that interview recorded?
Yes, ma'am, it was.
Okay, was that video and audio?
That one was only audio recorded.
Okay, all right. And did you review that recording before coming to court today?
Yes, ma'am.
Did you review the whole thing?
Yes, ma'am.
Did you also review a transcript of that recording?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, and was the transcript accurate as it pertains to what actually happened in the recording?
Yes, it was.
At this time, we would tender states 196 and 196A.
196 is the recording, 196A is the transcript.
Yes, sir.
Objection.
No objection.
No objection.
There it is.
Thank you. Now, Agent Seacrist, if you were to see Mr. Bryan in court, would you be able to recognize him?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, do you see him in court today?
Yes, ma'am, I do.
Can you please point him out and describe what he's wearing?
He is sitting to the far right at the defense table in a blue jacket and looks like a gray shirt, wearing glasses.
Okay, let the record reflect that he has identified William Bryan. May I approach? Thank you. There you go. So, Agent Seacrist, I'm showing you what's been admitted as 196A. Do you recognize 196A?
Yes, ma'am, I do.
Okay, what is it?
This is a transcript from my May 11, 2020 interview with Mr. Bryan.
Okay. Now, was Mr. Bryan under arrest at the time of this interview?
No, ma'am, he was not.
Okay. Was he detained in any way?
No, ma'am.
Was Mr. Bryan handcuffed at all?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Do you recall how he got to the interview location?
He drove on his own.
Okay. And was anyone else present during the interview?
During the interview, his attorney, Mr. Kevin Goff, was present, and another GBI agent by the name of Larry Kelly was present for a brief portion.
Okay. And do you remember what time it was when you interviewed him?
It was middle of the afternoon, maybe 2 o'clock hour, if I recall.
Okay. Would looking at the transcript help refresh your recollection?
I'm sorry, it's 3:40 p.m.
Okay. Now, did you promise Mr. Bryan that he would get anything of benefit from talking to you?
No, ma'am.
Did you promise him that he wouldn't be charged with a crime if he spoke with you?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Did you promise him he would get some kind of lesser sentence or plea deal or anything like that if he spoke with you?
No, ma'am.
Did you make any promises to his attorney, Mr. Goff, as it related to his client getting any kind of benefit from speaking to you?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Did you threaten Mr. Bryan in any way to talk to you?
I did not.
Now, did you actually explain to Mr. Bryan, even with his attorney there, that he didn't have to talk to you?
Yes, ma'am, I did.
Okay. And did you ask him if he understood that?
I did.
And what was his response?
He indicated that he did.
What, if anything, did you tell Mr. Bryan about leaving after the interview?
I advised Mr. Bryan that when the interview was completed, he would be able to go wherever he wanted to go. He would be free to leave.
Okay. And did he acknowledge that he understood that?
Yes, ma'am, he did.
Did Mr. Bryan appear to be under the influence of any drugs or alcohol during the interview?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Did he appear to understand what was going on?
Yes, he did.
Okay. And did you, in fact, specifically ask him if he's under the influence of anything?
Yes, ma'am.
And what did he say?
He said he was not.
Okay. Were there any limitations imposed on the May 11th interview?
There was.
And by whom?
Mr. Gall.
Okay, and what was that limitation?
The limitation on this interview was that we would only discuss things pertaining to what happened from the time he left the police department on February 23rd up to the current time.
Okay, current day being May 11th.
The day of the interview, yes, ma'am.
Okay, so nothing about the incident or before that?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, during the interview, how long was the interview? Do you remember, just like a ballpark?
I would say probably about an hour and a half.
Okay. So during that time, did a few questions come up that may have gone over those limitations?
They did.
Okay. And did you receive permission to still delve into those areas?
Yes, ma'am, I did.
Okay. So let's talk about the statements that Mr. Bryan made to you. Okay. Did you ask Mr. Bryan whether he knew Greg McMichael?
Yes, ma'am, I did.
Okay. And what did he say?
He indicated that he knew him from the neighborhood and from his work at the hardware store.
Okay. Whose work at the hardware store?
Mr. Bryan's work at the hardware store.
Okay. And did you ask him if he knew Travis McMichael?
Yes, ma'am.
And what did he say?
He said he did not.
Okay. Now, where did Mr. Bryan say he lived?
At 307 Burford Drive in Satilla Shores.
Okay. And how long did he say he lived at that location prior to February 23rd, 2020?
He lived there approximately 3 years.
3 years, okay. Did he at any time mention anything about purchasing that home?
Yes, ma'am.
What did he say?
He said he had just bought the house approximately 2 weeks before the incident.
Okay, so 2 weeks before February 23rd, 2020.
Yes, ma'am.
He had just purchased it.
That's correct.
Okay. Now, according to Mr. Bryan's statement, did Mr. Bryan say that he could see the victim's hands as the victim was running during the chase?
Objection, Your Honor. We're going to be referring, we understood, from the pretrial order to the man's name, not a characterization.
Well, I made no specific ruling on it. What I did ask the state was to use terminology that was not, to just use terminology that didn't, over and over again.
Over and over again. That's what I understood, Your Honor. Yes, sir.
So again, I did not in place a word ban, but if the state could
limit how many times I say it.
that would be preferable.
Yes, Your Honor, I will do my best. Let's see here. So, Agent Seacrist, according to Mr. Bryan's interview, did he talk about whether he was able to see Ahmaud's hands during this chase?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And what did he say about that?
He could see his hands; they were out, and he appeared to not be holding anything.
Okay. And I want to turn your attention to page 76 of the transcript, beginning at line 21. And if you can just read that to the jury, that would be great. Thank you.
To which line? 21
76, line 21
through
25.
Okay. Were his hands out like normal running, like running arms, like moving back and forth, or were they in his pockets, or do you remember? Mr. Bryan responded, no, they were out.
Okay. Now, did Mr. Bryan ever see a gun or other weapon in the victim's hands during the chase at all?
He did not.
Okay. And did you speak with Mr. Bryan about any thefts in the neighborhood right before the incident happened?
I did.
Okay. Did you speak with him about thefts while he was living in Satilla Shores?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And did he say he had anything stolen from him while he was living there?
He had.
Okay. Now, I want to turn your attention to page 84. lines 23 on to 85, line 10. If you can just read that, please.
Mr. Bryan said, I mean, the main thing was the trailer. It was 6x10, 8x10, 6x10, I think. Trailer behind the truck that went missing. And I'd have to clarify with a brother-in-law of what went missing out the back of his truck one night. But it was beer or something. I don't remember. Something petty. The trailer I never did report. Main reason, I didn't have it locked up and I was not sure when it went missing within a time frame of about a month. But now we're talking last year. I asked 2019. Mr. Bryan responded, yeah, man, it's been almost a year now.
Okay, so he had a trailer stolen from his residence,
Yes.
from the yard somewhere,
That's correct.
and that was in 2019.
Yes, ma'am.
And he said he never reported it to the police.
That's correct.
Okay, and he also mentioned about a brother-in-law
Yes,
who had some petty things stolen from how he characterized it.
that's correct.
Okay, other than that, did Mr. Bryan have any other specific thefts that occurred from his residence around that time?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Now, did Mr. Bryan mention about knowing about any kind of burglaries in the neighborhood, meaning breaking into houses?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Did you speak with him about knowing Ahmaud before that day?
Yes, ma'am.
What did he say? Did he know him?
He did not know.
Okay. Had he ever heard his name before?
No, ma'am.
Okay, so never met him, never heard his name.
No.
Okay. Did you speak with Mr. Bryan about knowing the owner of the 220 Satilla Drive construction site?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, and who was the owner of that site?
Mr. Larry English.
And what did Mr. Bryan say about knowing Mr. English? And I'm going to turn your attention to page 95, lines 20 through 24, if you can read that.
I asked, do you know Larry English? Mr. Bryan responded, no, not at all. And I said, the guy that owns the house that's under construction out there as you're going out. Mr. Bryan responded, no, I didn't know who owned it.
Okay, so he had never spoken with Mr. English.
That's correct.
Okay. Now, did you speak with Bryan regarding hearing from other neighbors who lived in Satilla Shores about thefts?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And what did he say about hearing about thefts? And I'm going to point you to page 96, lines 11 through 13, and then 16 through 23. So first 11 through 13.
I said, okay, have you had any other neighbors talk to you about thefts in the area or issues? Mr. Bryan said, not neighbors talking to me. And then I went, within the last year and a half, let's say year and a half or 2 years. So let's go back to the beginning of 2019. How about that? Mr. Bryan responded, not neighbors talking to me. A couple of times they came into the shop and say, you know, man, something else went missing. They didn't say who, if it was them or what. But you know, stuff has been going missing in the neighborhood.
Okay. And that's line 23, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, during the course of the interview, did you come to find out that Mr. Bryan had surveillance cameras up at his property?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And did those cameras face towards the front of the neighborhood, meaning Burford Road?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Now, did he say it was okay for you to come by his house and search those cameras and
Yes,
the footage?
He did.
Okay. And what did you do after he said it was okay to do that?
I believe I got a consent form signed.
Okay. Now, was his attorney present for that discussion when you asked him for consent?
Yes.
Okay. So after he told you that you could do that, did you go by the house?
After the conclusion of the interview, we did.
Okay. And who was present for that meeting at the house?
Of course, Mr. Bryan, Mr. Goff, myself, Agent Kelly, and I believe also Mr. Bryan's fiance at the time, Miss Amy Elrod.
Okay. And were you guys able to download anything on that day?
Not at that time while we were there, no.
Okay. Why not?
I believe there was, if I remember right, it was password issues and also internet speed issues that were holding us back from being able to get the video then.
Okay. So between you and Agent Kelly, who's the tech person?
Agent Kelly.
Agent Kelly. Okay. So is that why Agent Kelly was there with you?
Absolutely.
Okay. At some point later on, were you all able to download that surveillance footage?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Now, did you also follow up with Mr. Bryan about his cell phone and getting consent to search that cell phone?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And did you get a form? Did you get him to sign like a consent form for that?
I believe I did. Yes.
Okay.
No objection.
May I approach, Judge?
Yes.
Okay. So, Agent Seacrist, I'm showing you what's been marked for identification purposes as State's Exhibit 197. If you can look at it and tell me if you recognize it.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, what is it?
This is the waiver of constitutional rights to a search warrant of an electronic or cellular device.
Okay, and is it the form that you had Mr. Bryan sign on May 11th, 2020?
Yes, it was.
Okay, does it seem to be altered in any way?
No, ma'am.
At this time, we tender States, is that 198?
197.
197.
No objection.
No objection. Sorry, I can't see.
No objection.
It's good.
Thank you. Permission to publish, Judge?
Go ahead.
Thank you. So, Agent Seacrist, I'm just going to have you, are you able to see what's projected?
I can.
Enough to read it?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, let me try to zoom it in some. I don't break it. Okay, if you can just start from the top, that would be great. Okay. So if you can just read from here on down.
Waiver of constitutional rights to a search warrant of an electronic cellular device. I, William R. Bryan, Jr., having been informed of my constitutional right not to have a search and seizure made of my electronic/cellular device without a search warrant, and of my right to refuse to consent to such a search and seizure, hereby authorize Jason Seacrist/Larry Kelly of the GBI to use an extraction device to obtain information from my electronic/cellular device, including but not limited to any and all information, data, files, memory cards, photographs, videos, text messages, GPS locations, website information, emails, contact numbers, incoming and outgoing phone calls currently located on the below described device, iPhone 8, model MQ6 V2LL/A. I am giving this written permission to the above named investigator voluntarily and without threats or promises of any kind. I understand that any information derived from this evidence as a result of my consent to this search and seizure without a search warrant can and may be used as evidence against me in any court of law. I also have been provided contact information from the above stated investigator in order for me to withdraw my consent at any time. It is signed by Mr. Bryan. His name is printed below that. The time and date is written as May 11, 2020 at 3:54 p.m.
And whose signature is this?
That is mine.
And what about this one?
I believe that's Agent Kelly's.
Okay. And did you go over this form with Mr. Bryan before he signed it?
Yes, ma'am.
And did he appear to understand it?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Now, after the May 11th interview, did Mr. Bryan leave freely?
Yes, ma'am, he did.
Okay. And what did you do with this form? Did you contact another agent to get the phone extracted?
Yes, ma'am, Agent Kelly.
Okay. And what's an extraction, just briefly?
We use a device that actually plugs into the phone and just downloads all the information from the phone. It can also include not just information currently on the phone, but if the information has been deleted from the phone, we can sometimes get that information. So it gives us all the content off the phone.
Okay. Now, during that May 11th interview with Mr. Bryan, what, if anything, did you tell him about him being a witness?
In my initial conversation with Mr. Bryan, I identified him as a witness, as it starts off right now. I said that we had a lot of investigative work to do and that we had additional questions that we needed specifics on, and that would be the course of the investigation.
Okay. And then you proceeded to have 2 separate interviews with Mr. Bryan.
2 separate sit-down interviews. That's
Sit-down
correct.
interviews,
Yes.
okay. And did you also do like a reenactment video
Yes,
at
ma'am.
some point?
We did.
Okay. And was that around the Satilla Shores neighborhood?
It was.
Okay. Now, going to your second interview with him, what date was that?
On May 13th, 2020.
Okay, and where was that? Where was the location of that interview?
That was in the same location at the DNR office on Conservation Way in Brunswick.
Okay, and was that interview also recorded?
Yes, it was.
Have you reviewed that recording in anticipation for your testimony today?
Yes, ma'am.
So when you reviewed the recording, Agent Seacrist, was it a fair and accurate copy of the recording of the video you did, the interview you did with Mr. Bryan?
Yes, it was.
Okay. And in conjunction with that, did you also review a transcript?
I did.
Okay. And did the transcript match up with the interview you did with him?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Any alterations or deletions?
No, ma'am.
Okay, I'm going to show you this 198A for identification purposes. Tell me if you recognize that.
I do.
What is it?
This is the transcript from the interview with Mr. Bryan on May 13th, 2020.
Okay. Your Honor, at this time we tender states 198 and 198A.
No objection.
No objection.
No objection.
It's admitted.
Thank you. And you can just hold on to that. So, same questions about this interview. Was he under arrest? Was Mr. Bryan under arrest at that time when you interviewed him on the 13th?
No, ma'am.
Okay, was he in handcuffs in any way?
He was not.
Was he detained in any way?
No, ma'am.
Who else was present, if anyone,
His
for that
attorney,
interview?
Mr. Goff,
Okay. And how did he get to the location?
on his own.
Okay. Now, remember what time it was when you interviewed him on May 13th?
I believe that one was in the 2 o'clock hour.
It was 2 o'clock.
Yeah.
Okay. If I were to show you a copy of your report that you did, to summarize that, would that refresh your recollection?
It would. Yes, ma'am.
We have that marked as an exhibit for the record.
Which part?
Summary report.
Seacrist, I am showing you what's been marked just for identification as 412, State's Exhibit 412. Look at it and tell me if you know what that is.
Yes, ma'am.
What is it?
This is my report that I wrote regarding my interview with Mr. Bryan on May 13, 2020.
Okay, just look at it silently to yourself and tell me if that refreshes your recollection about the time of the interview.
It does.
Okay, what time was it?
2:35 p.m.
Okay, thank you. I'll take that back. Okay, so did you promise him anything during that interview?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Did you make any threats towards him or force him to into any interview with you?
No, ma'am.
Okay. And did you make any promises to Mr. Goff, his attorney?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Now, did Mr. Bryan appear to be under the influence of any drugs or alcohol?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Did you explain to Mr. Bryan that he didn't have to talk to you?
I did.
And did he appear to understand that?
Yes, ma'am, he did.
Okay. And did he still go ahead and proceed with the interview?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So let's get into some of his statements. What did Mr. Bryan say he was doing on the day of the incident when he noticed something was going on?
He was doing some work on his front porch.
Okay. And what did he say caught his attention?
Someone running and the sound of a vehicle engine.
Okay. And did Mr. Bryan say that he was listening to music or something like that?
He did. He was listening to music in his garage, which was on the opposite end of the house from where he was working outside.
Okay. But he could still hear a vehicle engine coming by.
That's correct.
Okay. And he said he saw somebody running as well.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Now, did he say he knew what was going on at that time?
He did not.
Okay. I'm going to direct your attention to page 7, lines 24 into page 8, line 6. And if you could just read that, please.
Mr. Bryan said, and for whatever reason, I don't. Well, I mean, at that point, I was like, okay, well, he's chasing him in the truck, whoever's in the truck, you know. And I'm figuring, I don't know. I don't know what's going on at that point, but I'm figuring something's wrong. And I, not really loud, but I said, you got him, you need help, something like that. Nobody could hear me though, I'm sure.
Okay. And what did Mr. Bryan do after that?
He walked over and grabbed his keys.
Okay, and where were his keys?
His keys were in his kitchen, which he accessed through his door in the garage.
Okay. Did you ask Mr. Bryan what made him grab his keys?
I did.
And what did he say? I'm going to direct you to page 8, line 21, into page 9, line 2.
I asked, and why were you going back to your truck? Why were you grabbing your keys? Mr. Bryan responded, I guess just to go see what was going on, if anything needed to be done, if I could help, or whatever. I mean, I didn't know. I mean, to be honest with you, I don't know what I was doing.
Okay. So he said he wanted to know if he could help.
That's correct.
Okay. And I'm going to direct your attention to page 13, lines 18 through 25.
I asked, what was it that made you decide I need to go get my key and get in my truck and see what's going on? Mr. Bryan responded, I really don't know. I said, okay. And then Mr. Bryan said, I can't answer that. I don't know. It just, you know, I'm thinking through my mind that maybe he's done something. The guy running, and I don't know.
Okay. And when he left his house, did he have a cell phone on him?
Yes, ma'am, he did.
Okay. And what, if anything, did Mr. Bryan say about recognizing the truck in question? If you can just read page 9, lines 3 through 14.
Three through 14.
3 through 14.
I said, okay, now real quick, just going to go back. You said you recognized the truck. Mr. Bryan said, uh-huh. I said, where did you recognize? How did you? Why did you recognize the truck? Mr. Bryan responded, I mean, I've seen it in the neighborhood. I mean, at that time, I didn't know exactly why really I recognized it. I said, okay. Mr. Bryan said, I didn't know from what house or if it had, you know, just being in the neighborhood driving around. I didn't really put it together until afterwards.
Okay. did Mr. Bryan ever say that he heard Ahmaud say anything during the chase?
He never heard Ahmaud say anything.
Okay. And did Mr. Bryan ever mention trying to slow down Ahmaud during the chase?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. I want to direct you to page 33, line 16, to page 34, line 2. If you can just read that.
Mr. Bryan stated, I figured if I'd slowed him down and got a picture that maybe something would happen in the end other than just him getting away and cops not knowing who he was. I said, so then that kind of makes me want to ask, why did the cops need to know? Mr. Bryan replied, because I figured he had done something wrong. I didn't know for sure. I stated, okay, what made you think he might have done something wrong? Mr. Bryan responded, it was just instinct, man. I don't know.
Okay. So he figured the victim had done something wrong, and it was just instinct that told him that.
Yes, ma'am. That's
That's
correct.
what he said. Okay. Now, did Mr. Bryan say that he felt the victim needed to stop running?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
I've lost track of how many times we've used the word victim here. I mean, that's the whole point. The jury's going to decide who the victim is here.
I can rephrase.
That's good. Ladies and gentlemen, the court has not banned the use of any words in this court. And what I had given the facts of this case and the positions of the parties, I asked the lawyer simply to use various terms. The witness can use whatever term he wants. And that's what's going on here. So if the state could refer to Mr. Arbery as Mr. Arbery and move on from there.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, Agent Seacrist, did Mr. Bryan say he felt Mr. Arbery needed to stop running?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And why did he feel that? Can you read page 37, line 5 through 10?
Mr. Bryan stated, yeah, I figured he stole something. I didn't know if he had shot somebody. I didn't know what was up. So I asked Mr. Bryan, had you heard any gunshots or anything like that? Mr. Bryan responded, no.
Okay. So Mr. Bryan said that he figured Ahmaud had shot somebody.
Yes, ma'am.
Object. First, I'll ask and answer. Second, I object to the characterization. Mr. Seacrist has already given his testimony about what was said, word for word, and I object to the characterization after the fact by the prosecution.
Judge, I'm not characterizing it. It's what he said.
Again, ladies and gentlemen, what the lawyer's asking questions is not testimony. Testimony comes from the witness stand. It's sustained. Go ahead and ask your next question.
Okay. Did you ask Mr. Bryan whether he ever said anything to Ahmaud when he was chasing him?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Did he say he said anything to Ahmaud?
No, ma'am.
Okay. What, if anything, did Mr. Bryan tell Ahmaud regarding he needed to stop running?
He didn't say anything.
Okay. What, if anything, did Mr. Bryan tell Ahmaud about wanting to talk to him?
Mr. Bryan didn't say anything.
Okay. What, if anything, did Mr. Bryan tell Ahmaud about wanting to arrest him for anything?
Mr. Bryan didn't say anything.
Now, did Mr. Bryan ever say anything about Ahmaud turning to look at him right before he was shot and killed?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And I want to turn your attention to page 63, lines 2 through 18. I'm sorry, lines 12 through 18. If you can just read that, please.
Mr. Bryan stated, I think I remember seeing Ahmaud turn around and look towards me, pulling up or either almost pulled. No, I ain't quite stopped yet. I'm still back a good ways, I believe. Yeah, I'm still back a good ways. and then he runs around the right-hand side of the truck, and I figured at this point he's going to cut the corner and go out on Satilla Drive. Is that what it's called?
Okay. And at the point where Ahmaud is near the second truck, did Mr. Bryan ever hear Ahmaud say anything?
No, ma'am.
So he never heard him make any threats or anything like that?
He did not.
Did you ever ask Mr. Bryan if he saw Ahmaud drop anything from his hands during the chase?
I did.
Okay, and what did he say?
He said he didn't see him drop anything.
Okay. Now, I want to talk to you about your conversation with Mr. Bryan pertaining to Larry English's construction site. Okay? Did you ask him if he had seen any of the videos?
I did.
Okay, from that construction site. And what did he say?
He said he had not seen any of the videos.
Okay. Did you ask him if he even knew if the videos existed?
I did.
And what did he say?
He didn't know anything about videos.
Okay. Now, during the course of your investigation, did you learn that Satilla Shores, that the neighbors would communicate with each other on like a Facebook page?
I did.
Okay. Did you ask Mr. Bryan about his knowledge of that Facebook page?
Yes, ma'am.
And what did he say?
He was not a member and was not familiar with that Facebook page.
Okay. Now, did you follow up with Mr. Bryan about his knowledge of thefts in Satilla Shores around the time Ahmaud died?
I did.
Okay. And I want to turn your attention to page 85, lines 21 into page 86, line 21.
I asked, okay, so just to get a clear picture, the only specific thefts at the time of this event that you knew about from what you told me are your trailer. Mr. Bryan responded, uh-huh. Then I stated, your brother-in-law, some stuff out of the bed of your brother-in-law's truck. Mr. Bryan responded, uh-huh. I stated, anything else specific? Mr. Bryan said, specific, no. I had heard that there had been some. And I stated, that's just in general? And Mr. Bryan said, in general. I asked, but no real specific incidents? And Mr. Bryan said, nothing. You know, what was stolen, what house, where, when? I asked, when it happened? Mr. Bryan said, no. I said, what was, none, nothing? Mr. Bryan said, no. I said, only that, hey, there's some folks doing some. And when you talk about break-ins, what are you talking about? People going into houses, busting windows? Mr. Bryan responded, I think I heard a car. I said, car? Okay. Mr. Bryan responded, something about a car one time.
Okay. So he heard about a car one time.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Had he heard about any descriptions of the person who was allegedly responsible, person or persons, for any of this stuff?
No, ma'am.
Okay. So he didn't know if it was a black person, white person, Asian person, nothing?
He did not know.
Okay. Now, did you find out during the course of your interview with him that Mr. Bryan also had a Facebook account?
I did.
Okay. And did you ask for his consent to look at that Facebook account?
Yes, ma'am.
And was that when his attorney was still present?
Yes, ma'am.
And what did Mr. Bryan tell you?
He was willing to allow me to download his Facebook account, but the account was deactivated at the time, so we reactivated it so that we could.
So you reactivated it so that you could download it?
That's correct.
Okay. And did that download happen?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Now, after the interview concluded, was that your last time talking to him?
No, ma'am.
Okay. When was the next time?
Immediately after this interview was when we did the drive-through.
Okay. And when you say the drive-through, where drive-through in which neighborhood?
So we did a drive-through reenactment of the February 23rd in Satilla Shores.
Okay. And was that Mr. Bryan's route?
Yes, ma'am.
That pertained to his route?
It was.
Okay. And do you remember about what time you all went out there? Like, was it still light outside?
It was.
Okay. All right. And who all was present?
In the vehicle at the time would have been myself, Mr. Bryan, his attorney, Mr. Goff, and also another GBI agent, special agent in charge, Jamie Steinberg.
Okay. And was that recorded?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. May I approach, Your Honor?
Yes.
Now, Agent Seacrist, were you able to review that recording prior to coming into court today?
Yes, ma'am.
And was it fair and accurate?
It was.
Okay. Did you also review a transcript of that recording?
I did.
Was that transcript fair and accurate?
Yes, ma'am, it was.
Okay. I'm going to show you what's been marked for the purpose of identification as states 199A. Can you look at it and tell me what it is?
Yes, ma'am. This is the transcript from the reenactment with Mr. Bryan on May 13, 2020.
Okay. When you reviewed it, were there any alterations or anything like that?
No, ma'am.
Okay. At this time, we would tender states 199 and 199A.
Oh, no objection. No objection.
No objection.
Admitted.
You can hold on to that. Now, before you hit record during that kind of reenactment, did anything happen in terms of any kind of preliminary drive-through?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, tell us what happened.
Mr. Bryan was having difficulty remembering the exact path of travel. So there was kind of a familiarization ride through to kind of get directly down to what the path of travel was before we actually recorded the reenactment.
Okay. But at any time, did you tell Mr. Bryan what to say?
Not at all.
Okay. Now, during your interviews with Mr. Bryan, did you learn from him that the police found some smudges on his truck?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And did you also learn that those smudges had been lifted from his truck?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Did you speak with Mr. Bryan about getting fingerprints from him?
Yes, ma'am.
And why?
You get fingerprints from people who are known to use whatever the item is that has the fingerprints on it, to get what we call elimination prints, so that we can compare those to see if they are the person that the property belongs to or not.
Okay. And did he agree to give you fingerprints for that purpose?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And did he consult with his attorney before agreeing with that?
Yes, ma'am.
Did you also speak with Amy Elrod about that?
Yes, ma'am.
And did she agree to give fingerprints as well?
She did.
Okay. And was that for the same purpose?
It was.
Okay. So at some point, did you meet with both of them?
Yes, ma'am.
When?
I believe it was the next day on May 14th.
Okay. And what happened when you met with them on that day?
I met them at, I believe it was the hospital parking lot, and we rode to the Glenn County Jail, where a jailer was able to take their fingerprints, and then I took them back to their vehicle.
Okay, so just to be clear, were they under arrest when they went
not.
to that jail?
No,
Okay,
ma'am.
it was just for the purpose of fingerprinting them.
That's correct. That was all pre-planned as far as the logistics of how that would happen.
Okay, all right. Now, at some point during the course of your investigation, did you ask Mr. Bryan for consent to download the computer system in his truck?
Yes, ma'am, I did.
Okay, and what happened? Did he give consent?
He did.
Okay. What, if anything, were you able to find?
Nothing that was pertinent to this investigation.
Okay, and why was that?
So the computers in your vehicles only store certain information for a brief period of time. So most of the data that was relevant to February had already been overwritten by May.
Okay. Are you familiar with a person by the name of Larry English?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, and how are you familiar with Mr. English?
He's the owner of the house that was under construction where Mr. Arbery was seen on the videos.
Okay. During the course of this investigation, did you meet with Mr. English?
Yes, ma'am.
Do you remember where that meeting happened?
That meeting happened at his residence in McMichaels, Georgia, which is in Coffee County.
Okay. And what was the purpose of that meeting?
purpose of the meeting was to get his statement regarding the investigation and what had occurred, especially to find additional videos that we had seen floating around and to get more context around his involvement and what led up to Mr. Arbery's death.
Okay. I want to turn your attention to May 21st, 2020. Okay. Was there anything noteworthy that happened on that day in terms of the investigation?
Mr. Bryan was arrested.
Okay. And any other warrants?
We did a search warrant of his house, and we also did a search warrant of his phone.
Okay. And were you present for that search warrant execution on his house?
I was.
Okay. Were other agents also present?
Yes, ma'am.
At the time you interviewed Mr. Bryan on May 11th and May 13th, had the video already surfaced? The video of this incident?
Yes, it had.
Okay. And had the McMichaels, had warrants already been signed for their arrests?
Yes.
Okay. Now, during the course of your investigation, did you learn that Mr. Bryan had given previous statements to officers from Glynn County PD?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And in preparation for your interview on May 11th and May 13th, did you review those statements?
I did.
Okay. And since those interviews, May 2020, have you reviewed those statements again?
Yes, ma'am, I have.
Okay. What, if anything, did you notice in Mr. Bryan's statements to the Glynn County Police Department as it compared to his statements to you?
His statements to the Glynn County Police Department were more direct in his involvement to corral and box in Mr. Arbery during the event. His statements to me minimized his involvement in that process that led to Mr. Arbery's death.
Okay, so we'll just talk about a few instances of that, okay? Were you able to review the transcripts of those statements given to Officer Minshew and Detective Lowry?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Objection here. I'm not sure where the state's going. Is this prosecutor about to ask a witness for his opinions about what other witnesses were told? Is he going to be giving his opinions to the jury about whether he thinks one statement is this and another statement is that, or is he testifying about what he knows? Because I'm trying to figure out how this line of questioning is proper, and I object to it.
Your Honor, both statements to Officer Minshew and Investigator Lowry were tendered, so they're in evidence. I am not about to ask Agent Seacrist about his opinion on the statements. We're just going to go through a couple of the quotes from those statements in comparison to the statements to Agent Seacrist. But quotes, no opinions.
Again, that sounds like a closing argument, which is perfectly fine at its time. But this witness can testify to what this witness knows. And this line of questioning seems designed to put us in a position where we're going to have to make a motion that none of us wants to make.
Your Honor, I don't see how when the statements have come in already. They're in evidence.
That was never the point. It doesn't matter whether they're in evidence or not. The jury's already heard them. The jury will decide whether they're consistent or not. Whether Mr. Seacrist thinks they're consistent or not, that's something for the lawyers to argue. That's not for one witness. You can't call an expert witness to say whether they believe somebody or not. This is highly improper.
Yes, all you're doing is comparing the two statements.
Yes, Your Honor. I'm not going to ask him for his opinion.
But, I mean, if they're both in the record, what? I mean, he's taken one statement, and she took the other statement.
Yes, Your Honor. Well, Judge, I think it's completely relevant. I'm not going to go through both statements from front to back again, but I just wanted to pinpoint a couple areas where Mr. Bryan said something completely different to Agent Seacrist versus what he said in here to Officer Minshew and Detective Lowry.
30 years. I've never heard of any such thing. I think maybe we should take this up outside the presence of the jury.
Ladies and gentlemen, why don't you go ahead and take a step into the jury.
All right for the jury.
Mr. Goff.
All right, I object, the prosecutors laid this foundation that Mr. Bryan is characterized as changing his statements. That's well and good for a closing argument, but you can't call witnesses for the purpose of challenging credibility of the defendants in that way. Anybody. I have never even heard of such a thing being done in the trial of a criminal case, much less a murder case. You can't have one witness testify as to whether what another witness has been doing or editorializing as to what he thinks that means. He can testify to what he knows. This is highly improper. Highly improper.
And Judge, I'm not asking Agent Seacrist to editorialize anything. I'm going to ask him about specific quotes, not a lot of them, a couple, from each statement, and then ask him what Mr. Bryan said specifically to him on the same subject. That's it. Not to ask him how they differ or,
The objection is the state. He can testify to what his statement was. If the state wants to go ahead and argue differences in the statement, you're welcome to do so as part of the argument. But for him to comment on a statement given to another officer, of course not going to permit that. So that's sustained. Let me also address since we've got a break here, with the use of the term victim. Let me be very clear, because you mentioned a pre-trial ruling. The court has not implemented a word ban in this case. What I said, and what I think was told to me at the time, was that I generally don't implement word bans, and what I was told was that everybody would be very cognizant of that and understand that that term in this particular case brings a number of issues in. What I was told by the state was there was going to be an attempt to at least reduce the use of that. I sustained the objection because the court saw that as being the term that was being used with this witness. That word ban is still not in place, because I realized after I'd made my ruling it sounded like I'd changed that. That is not the case. The court found under these circumstances that was the term that you were using over and over to describe Mr. Arbery under these circumstances. So I just wanted to clear that up. So the court's ruling, pre-trial ruling, has not changed. I just want everybody to be aware of the terminology we're using under the circumstances and facts of this case. So
Yes, Your Honor.
let's go ahead and get the panel.
All right for the jury.
All right. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We are ready to proceed with the evidence from the state.
Agent Seacrist, what did Mr. Bryan say to you in your interview with him on May 13th regarding the moments when he left his driveway? If you can turn to page 25 of the May 13th statement, lines 18 into page 26, line 19.
Mr. Bryan stated, and, for whatever stupid reason again, there's going to be some reasons here that I don't understand why I did it. I jumped out in the road from my driveway at about the same time he got there. I asked, so did you straight out? Mr. Bryan responded, yeah. So I asked, so you didn't go left or right, you just kind of went straight? Mr. Bryan responded, straight, well, maybe a tad to the left. I asked, angled a little bit? Mr. Bryan responded, just a tad. I said, okay. Now why did you pull out and angle it to the left like that? Mr. Bryan responded, I guess so I could see. I said, okay. And what did you see? Mr. Bryan responded, And I'm thinking at this point, you know, I mean, it's running through my mind at this point. Try to get a picture. I said, okay. Mr. Bryan said, but I hadn't got my phone out. I don't believe at this point. I said, okay. Mr. Bryan responded, all right, what did I see? I seen him run right, straight in front of my truck. I asked, around the hood? Mr. Bryan responded, around the hood, through the ditch.
Okay. So at any point as he's describing going from his driveway to Burford Road, did Mr. Bryan ever say that he tried to force Mr. Arbery into the ditch in front of his house?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Did he at any point say he tried to block him?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Now, did you talk to Mr. Bryan about the circumstances surrounding his belief that Mr. Arbery tried to get into his truck somehow?
I did.
Okay. So I want to turn your attention to page 28, line 20, starting from the word he, into page 29, line 14. And if you can just read that, I'm sorry.
Mr. Bryan said, he was just down there low, not in the road. He comes up out of there at about the time we get around a tree, and we got really close to each other. I pull him past him, and this is another one where I'm really fuzzy at, man. But the only one neighbor that, and at the time I don't remember if I knew his name or not, but there is a neighbor, Tommy, up there, and I angled up into his drive with kind of like a mailbox there. All right. I don't know what the hell I was doing there, all right? Because at about that point I realized I'm in front of him. He's behind me. My windows are down. I said, uh-huh. Mr. Bryan continued, all right, and he's coming. So I backed up to try to get straight, and at that point he's on me. He's coming. He's on me. And I'm just like, man, I got to get out of here. So, I mean, I think I put it in drive or whatever at that point. I'm trying to haul ass, and he's on my door with his hands at the door handle. I hit gas, you know, keeping in mind, I'm not trying to swing the boards out the back, you know.
So, in him describing that incident to you, at any point did Mr. Bryan say he tried to corner Ahmaud?
No, ma'am.
At any point did he say he tried to cut him off, or he had cut him off real good?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Now, in your statement, in your interview with him, did you confront Mr. Bryan about using the word block in his previous statement to the police officers versus what he told you?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And what did he say? And I'll turn your attention to page 26. I'm sorry, page 33. So it starts at line 11. Line 11 to line 15 for now.
Okay. I said, uh-huh. Were you trying to, because I think in your original statement, and again, I'm not trying to pin you down. I'm just going back because I have to listen to it all. You talk about trying to box him in and do different things. Were you?
Okay. And go ahead and read from line 16 through 19.
Mr. Bryan responded, I figured if I slowed him down and got a picture, that maybe something would happen in the end, other than just him getting away and cops not knowing who he was.
Okay. And go ahead and read to lines 25.
I responded, so then that kind of makes me want to ask, why did the cops need to know? Mr. Bryan responded, because I figured he had done something wrong. I didn't know for sure. I said, okay, what made you think that he might have done something wrong?
And flipping the page, lines 1 and 2.
Mr. Bryan responded, it was just instinct, man. I don't know.
Your Honor, at this time, I would like to publish the reenactment video, permission to publish that? It's been admitted? Yes.
You got one. All right. So I thought I was going to try.
So, Judge, the way we agreed with the defense to play this is on mute with Agent Seacrist narrating.
To say that with my agreement would be incomplete.
That was not your agreement?
You know what? You just go ahead. You go right ahead. I withdraw my objection.
Okay. McMichaels?
No objection.
So, Agent Seacrist, can you see
I can.
on your screen? Okay, so I'm going to press play. Where are you right now?
We are sitting in the driveway of Mr. Bryan's residence. We are backed in.
Okay, and that's 307 Burford Road?
That's correct.
Okay, and who is seated in the driver's seat?
I'm in the driver's seat.
And who is seated in the front passenger seat?
Mr. Bryan.
Okay, and who is seated in the back?
On the back seat, we have Mr. Goff and we have Jamie Steinberg.
Okay. So if you could just tell the jury.
Yeah, he's telling us right now where, as he's getting in his car and what he's fixing to do. He wants to drive out and he's angling to the left in the direction that they went. And he's saying right around here is where Mr. Arbery pops up. So he's backing up because it surprises him. Doesn't back in quite enough to where when he makes the turn, he's getting close. He says he's about to hit his mailbox, and Mr. Arbery is down in the ditch. And they're running, he's running somewhat parallel to the vehicle, to his vehicle.
Okay, so I'm going to pause.
Mhm.
Do you see the ditch? In the
Yes,
video?
ma'am, I can.
Can you step down?
I can.
Briefly? And don't touch the screen because bad things will happen.
Okay.
But if you can just point to the general direction, there's a pointer right there to your right if you want to use that.
Don't touch the screen.
Don't touch the screen.
You can see the ditch right through here. That's almost like a little, I think that's, might be a little footbridge right there over it.
Okay.
And the ditch is running right through here.
Okay, thank you. Have a seat. Let me know when you're ready. Good?
I'm ready.
Okay.
He's explaining that Mr. Arbery is down in the ditch, maybe not quite in the water, but he's down that ditch that way. He's going to start coming up and still kind of running parallel. They're coming up to a tree right here where you can see a sign. I think it's maybe a realtor sign. As they're coming up, he's expecting Mr. Arbery to go maybe around the tree, the other direction, but he ends up coming, sorry, not this tree, this next tree. He's coming up, he's thinking Mr. Arbery is going to go to the left of the tree, but Mr. Arbery actually goes to the right of the tree, so they're right there close to each other at this tree right here. So Mr. Arbery is between the tree and tree on his left and his truck on the right. As they come up, he pushes ahead at this point. He gets ahead of Mr. Arbery, and as he comes into this driveway, he actually angles off, and that's where he was trying to stop his movement. He was trying.
Okay, sorry. Now, in this actual reenactment, did Mr. Bryan ever say that at this point he tried to corner Mr. Arbery?
No, ma'am, he did not.
Did he say he tried to block him?
He did not.
Okay.
he is angling off into Mr. Arbery's direction and Mr. Arbery's path of travel. At this point, he says his window's down. He realizes that he's put himself in a bad position, and he starts to back up. And it's somewhere in that time frame where the contact is made between Mr. Arbery and the vehicle. Whether or not Mr. Arbery is reaching for the door handle or whether he's just touching the truck, that's where the contact is made. And Mr. Bryan said he was worried at this point, so he put the vehicle in drive, and that's when he took off ahead of Mr. Arbery again. Here he's turning off of Burford onto Satilla Shores, or Satilla Drive.
Okay, so is that this road right here?
Yes, ma'am, it is. We've just passed Holmes Road, and he, at this point, stops, backs up as Mr. Arbery makes the turn down Holmes Road. At this point, Mr. Arbery is ahead, and Mr. Bryan is essentially chasing Mr. Arbery down Holmes Road.
Is this Holmes Road right here?
Yes, ma'am. As we get down the road here, you're going to see I think you'll be able to see a brightly colored mailbox. I believe at the time it was blue. And that was an important marker because that was where the video that he took on February 23rd began. You could see the actual brightly colored mailbox.
Okay.
So it was
Are we able to see the mailbox right now?
yes, ma'am.
Okay. Is it this one right here?
Through my dirty windshield, yes, ma'am.
Yes.
It is.
Okay.
So we pause. He confirms he's on the left side of the road at that time when the video starts. You actually see at this point in the video, and that's what we're talking about, is you see Mr. Arbery, I think he was briefly running away and then comes running back towards Mr. Bryan in the video. Mr. Bryan believed that Mr. Arbery ran down his passenger side, I believe.
Okay. So at this point, is Mr. Bryan still driving on the wrong side of the road?
Yes, ma'am. We're discussing just different angles and where things were coming and going and referencing back to the actual video that he took in February. He's told me somewhere right at that point, after Mr. Arbery passed him, that he had gotten back over onto the right side of the road. Now, during this portion of the actual video on the day of the incident in February, he had dropped the phone, or put it on his lap, I think was what it was. So he's telling us what happened here, and he's saying how he went down a little bit farther. Now, the mailbox you see right there on the right side with the driveway, that's actually another marker that we can kind of identify from the actual video on the day of the incident.
Which one?
Yep, right there to the right. That black mailbox and driveway is something it looks like fresher concrete. You just tell with the, I guess the landscaping kind of you can identify it in the video. He drives past that, and at some point he decides to turn around and basically does like a 3-point turn where he's talking about on the video. You can hear maybe his tires trying to catch on gravel. And he's showing me where one of two spots he likely, pulled over to the left, backed in, and then pulled back out to the left to go back the direction that Mr. Arbery came, back to the intersection of Holmes Road and Satilla Drive.
So at this point, where's Mr. Arbery?
Mr.
Which
Arbery
direction?
is going to be, well, if you're looking at it from my truck, he's going to be to the left, which is close to the intersection of where the incident occurred, basically.
So going back towards the intersection.
That's correct. And here, if you pause right here, this is where we know that the video where he picked up at because of that driveway. And in the video we're talking about, you can see the curve of the road and trying to figure out, where he was in the road. He says he's kind of center of the road. We're going around, and at which point he actually sees Mr. Arbery. And we're determining where it was that he stopped at when he actually finally stopped and finished taking the video. We're inching up to the spot where he thinks he was. If you see the stop sign there, you can see the intersection. That's the intersection of where the incident occurred.
Okay. And does he essentially stop?
Yes, ma'am.
Right there?
Yes, ma'am.
Now, Agent Seacrist, throughout that entire reenactment video with Mr. Bryan, did he ever once say that he tried to angle at Mr. Arbery?
I don't recall him saying angle at Mr. Arbery, no.
Okay. Did he ever say that he tried to block Mr. Arbery in?
No, ma'am.
That he tried to corner him at any time?
No, ma'am.
Okay. So none of that was said on that video?
That's correct.
Now, may I approach? Okay. So, Agent Seacrist, I'm going to show you what's been marked for the purposes of identification as State's Exhibit 303. Go ahead and look at it and tell me if you recognize it.
Yes, ma'am, I do.
What is it?
This is a map from Google Earth that was created based on Mr. Bryan's statements of his path of travel in the Satilla Shores neighborhood when the incident occurred.
Okay, and was that created by GBI?
Yes, ma'am. It
Okay.
was.
Is it fair and accurate?
Yes, ma'am. It is.
At this time, we tender 303.
No objection.
No objection.
Submitted.
Permission to publish, Your Honor.
Go ahead.
Okay.
We're discovering there's about 3 people in the world that can run this thing. One's Mr. Sheffield, one is Ms. Donikowski.
Thank you. Okay. Agent Seacrist, can you see this clearly?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Turn it just like that. And can you step down, please?
Okay.
Okay. Okay, so remember, don't touch the screen. So go ahead and describe to us what we're looking at here on 303.
Okay. What we have is, again, the Satilla Shores neighborhood. You're looking at Satilla Shores. Satilla Shores or Satilla Drive is right here.
Okay.
This drive right here actually comes down here, I believe. This is Burford, right here. This is Holmes. And then this is Zellwood.
Okay,
Highway 17 is going to be up here.
okay. What is this that we're seeing right here?
That's Mr. English's residence.
Okay, and what is this one?
That's the McMichael residence.
Okay, and just go ahead and show us, what is this one?
That's Mr. Bryan's house.
Okay, so go ahead and just explain the route.
Sure. As you saw in the video, Mr. Bryan's house is right here. He pulls out and eventually turns right out of his residence and comes down here towards Satilla Drive. You see this little part that pulls up on Satilla? That's where he pauses and then backs up down to here before he drives forward onto Holmes. And when he's going down Holmes is when he's initially behind Mr. Arbery. At some point in here would be where Mr. Arbery turns around and comes back towards the intersection while Mr. Bryan continues down somewhere here before he then turns around back to the intersection where the incident occurred.
Okay, and that is based on the reenactment video, what Mr. Bryan told you
Yes, ma'am.
months after the incident actually happened.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. Can have a seat. Seacrist, remember we talked about the surveillance system
Yes,
at
ma'am.
Mr. Bryan's house? Now, you said Agent Kelly was there with you when you all were trying to download that?
That's correct.
Okay, and was he the one who actually did the form for that one?
I believe he did. Yes, ma'am.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right. That is all I have for you. Thank you. The defense might have some questions for you, okay?
All right, this could take a while. I need a bathroom break.
Ladies and gentlemen, why don't we take a 15-minute recess, sort of mid-afternoon, then we'll get back into the evidence. Thank you.
All rise for the jury. Seated.
All right, Agent, you can go ahead and step down. If you could please be back within about 10 minutes to be ready to go. I remind you, you're under oath. Please do not discuss your testimony with anybody. Yes, sir. Thank you. All right, we're in recess for 15 minutes.